well, you know, that's like just your opinion, man.
So hello and welcome to the Audio Opinion Show, where audio people gather to give their opinions about things for both fun and nonprofit. I am your host, Brian Maddox. I am joined by my co-host, Andy Broughton, from the great country of Canada. And that's why he said, hey, because that just is sort of a thing. And then I've got, looks like, I don't know, I can't count past two, but I've got some other folks that are old friends, new friends, medium-sized friends joining us. It looks like most of the folks we're all kind of live event people, you know, ish. So we're sort of, yeah, Nathan, you're sort of a live event person. You still count. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of variance in our opinions. We'll see how that goes.
At all. No.
At all. So we're going to just go ahead and get going with the first poll, because that's how this rolls. So the most important question is the first question. And the first question is, during the filming of the greatest movie ever made, and if you don't know what is the greatest movie ever made, you can hit leave meeting. It's right on the bottom. Which cast member was the one most concerned with being fired? One, was it Carrie, who of course played Wesley? Two, was it Robin, who of course was the Princess Bride? Was it Mandy? Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. Or was it Wallace Shawn, who played Vicini? Which of these four actors was, and believe it or not, this is not a trick question. Believe it or not, this is actually a real question.
Not fired in the movie, but fired from the movie, correct?
From the movie, exactly. So this is literally
just part
of
the story of the movie.
It's like literally this is the behind the scenes. Which actor was like, I am going to get fired from this at any moment.
And I know the answer, but I can't even vote.
It's almost like I designed it that way. So I see 5 votes. I see 6 votes. There's only 7 of us, and there's okay. Now we're there. So I'm going to go ahead and end this poll. Boom. And I'm going to share the results. And the results looks like most of you voted for Mandy Patinkin, and Mandy has been known to be a little insecure sometimes about his roles. However, that is not the correct answer.
What?
According to, and I've now read this in several different places, and he's actually admitted, Wallace Shawn, the infamous, inconceivable person who had the greatest freaking role, I think, in the whole movie, was really, really worried every day that the director was just going to be like, what you're doing is not working and you're out of here.
Wally is also a little insecure.
Well, there you go. Yes,
I thought I heard an interview with Mandy saying, I can't believe I'm part of this thing.
Yes. I mean, there was some of that, but for what it's worth, and this is based on Carrie Elwes' book, but there's enough anyway. Who cares? It's the most important question, but who cares? That's really that's what this show's about. All right, so we're going to actually talk about what topic are we going to talk about tonight. So we're just going to launch that, and so I'm going to read off the options since our folks on YouTube can't see this. Option number 1: if you could tour with analog, would you? 2: is the Avid concept of, quote, you can use the external plugins you want, unquote, really valid? 3, and this is a repeat of a topic we've talked about before intentionally, to smart or not to smart? That is the question. To use the technical objective tools or to use our ears or both? Finally, in your opinion, what types of personal biases affect what we hear? And that's my personal question I threw in there, and emphasis on what types of personal biases affect what we hear, not just do they affect or not, because I think they do. So I have
7 of 8. We're waiting for one
7
more. There we go.
I now have 8 of 8, and so we're gonna And we're going to share the results. And yay, I win, even though I didn't vote. We are going to talk about what types of personal biases affect what we hear. What types of personal biases? And I'm going to hit this and get rid of this so we can see. And then I'm going to do what I always do, which is put Andrew Broughton on the hot seat.
Why me?
And make him at least start the conversation. What types of personal biases, when you think of that, do you think really affect what we hear or what we think we hear?
Yeah. Well, whenever I hear a topic like that, I always think of that great video by Ethan Weiner where he shows people words on a page and then they hear them. They hear the song, the Zeppelin song backwards, and it all is gibberish. And then they put the words up on the screen and you immediately hear those words perfectly in the backwards lyrics. It's amazing how well that works. So I'm thinking that if I heard it and other people heard it, well, we must do this all the time. We must sit there and go, can't you hear that thing? That thing is there's something there. But what sort of things would I say affect my bias of what I hear? I don't know. I guess that's the funny thing. I don't really know whether what I hear is what somebody else hears. And Brian and I, you and I were talking about this. It would be so amazing to sit with a group of other sound people and just, watching a show and go, let's discuss what we heard. What did you hear? What did you like? What didn't you like? And get those opinions. It's very rare that I get a chance to sit down with another sound engineer who's done this for a living and can talk about, did you like the way the sound of that instrument sounded? Or do you think that's a good way that this rig should sound? What did you like? What didn't you like? And I'm always wondering, whenever I listen to something, I go, I think it sounds good. Would somebody else think it sounds good? Or I think that's a real problem, that sound I'm hearing. Does anybody else notice that? Does anybody else care? So biases, I don't really have an opinion about what might bias what I hear.
I'm impressed by the fact that you don't have any biases.
Well,
that was my takeaway.
Not that I know of. I don't know. I'm sure I have lots, but I can't think of one.
You guys don't think that when you see a certain mixer or style of speaker that your biases are in there?
I try not to. No.
Well, and you just hit on the crux of, which is why I kind of chose this conversation, because the beautiful thing when you start talking about biases is that they're largely not in our control. And that's the thing. We like to think they are. We like to think that, it doesn't matter to me if it says Behringer or Midas on it. Like I can, I will hear the difference if there's a difference, to pick on Behringer and Midas or whatever. But the reality is it's not always so easy to divorce yourself from that. Anybody besides me have an opinion?
I wonder if I have biases.
Different view.
If I could jump in, my problem is not necessarily that I have biases towards one thing in specifically, but I hear things and I'm like, oh, hey, that sounds good. Or that also sounds good. All of these things sound good. And especially when I'm, like I've worked with Pete a lot, Pete Wiejaczka a lot. And I've heard him mix on several different consoles and they all sound good. And they all perform a very specific task for the show at hand. But that's been my problem. And that applies to not just audio things, but all things in my life. I mean, being open to ideas and just the way that things sound differently is one way to do things, but just being open to ideas in general and being okay with things sounding different or things being different is, I don't know if that's bias related, but I have a hard time being biased towards one thing or the other.
Do you think that's a byproduct of the quality of the person? When someone's
absolutely.
a rookie, they have a lot of opinions. They see a Behringer, they're like, oh, that's terrible. And go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard great mixes on a VRX rig. I feel like I can make a lav sound really good on a VRX rig when you have to. But I've also heard a lav sound really very poorly on a big L acoustics rig, regardless of whether that's the mixer or just, how terrible the environment is that this person is mixing in. I mean, I've seen some of the best engineers in the world sweat, during mixing a live show because, the PA was designed wrong, and this is what they got,
But it's an interesting thing, exactly what you just said, Alex, where do you find yourself, however, being surprised when you hear a bad sounding lav on a good PA and a good sounding lav on I'll just say bad PA just for simplicity's sake? And do you think that kind of element of, well, that's interesting, because there's a certain amount of preconceived bias that you have when you see, it's a great PA, it should, do you think do you think just the act of actually being surprised by what you're hearing actually affects what you're hearing?
I would think
that makes
so.
Any sense.
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, I'm not qualified to be on this panel of distinguished engineers, but I have heard some mixes, that, I'm like, wow, I did expect something different. But I've also done enough shows to know that there is probably something else going on, because I've also heard that engineer mix really, really stellar shows. So if something sounds off or something doesn't sound right, there's probably something else behind that. There's probably a reason why this person isn't getting the result that they want,
That's often very difficult to tell. You walk into a particular venue with a particular band and engineer, and you're listening going, well, that's not very good. What is it? It's almost like detective work going, the PA looks like it's in the right spot and looks like it should be working. And, this looks okay. Is it, what's going on? What's actually going wrong? If you're not the person, with your hands on it, it's sometimes very difficult to determine where the source of that bad sound actually is.
It's really easy for all of us to be like, oh, well, yeah, that doesn't sound good. And just, not stop considering it and walk away, when there's something else going on.
And conversely, if it sounds good, it is good. I mean, it's not, don't look at the EQ on the graph and don't look at the PA and don't look at the band. Just shut your eyes for a second. And if it sounds good, then it doesn't matter how they got there. And there's a thousand ways to skin a cat.
But isn't it maddening when you walk into a concert and it something sounds really wrong? Like the vocal mic is feeding back at 150 hertz all night or something, and you look over and the guy's grooving to the songs and drinking a beer, and you just is and the PA tech is sitting there with his arms crossed, and it's all you want to do is walk over there and be like, hey,
can I get that for you? Let me just
try to throw M&Ms at the graph to get the fader that you need.
But I think that's a byproduct of the level of the engineer on the show. Because after a certain point, it's never the system. It's always the system. Something's going wrong. It's rarely the engineer. So,
well, and just I mentioned this in the pre-show with Andy, because this question was sort of germinated from a question that was on Pro Sound Web that I threw my 2 cents worth in on, and I made the statement which I'll stand by, which is that all humans hear things similarly, but no humans hear things the same. And that's that similarly thing, perfect example, Pete, of you walk in and 150 is just ringing. 90% of the people who would walk in, especially if you pointed it out, would hear 150 is ringing, they would hear that. So that's a similar, or, another example would be if someone has heard a cello before and they know what a cello sounds like, and you play a cello, they know what a cello sounds like.
Man,
there's a whole big, much bigger aspect to this whole thing, though, which is cultural biases and educational biases.
Yes.
And just to give you a real good example, I would say, has anyone ever tried to mix a Chinese opera? because it's really hard when you're not used to how Chinese operas actually should sound.
I
or a
went to,
Vietnamese band, you know, and
I
I've
went
had
to
to
see
do
a
this
Chinese-
a few times.
I went to see a Chinese opera that a friend of mine, who I respect highly as a mixer, was mixing, and I thought it sounded awful. and
because
we
part
don't
of the
listen to
thing
that.
Yeah, exactly. We're not brought up to understanding how that music is supposed to sound. I would say the same thing about Latin music. I've heard a lot of really good mixers really murder Latin music because there's a definitive balance, a musical balance that's required. It's not heavy on the kick drum, the bass and the left hand of the piano are important, the claves, all the percussion instruments are super important, and really on records are usually layered on top. But you go to lots of live shows and they're just buried in kick and snare because it's rock and roll. You know?
Yeah, timbales is.
Timbales, yeah. I mean, it's the Latin cowbell, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure we've all been to festivals where there's a house engineer who's mixing all of the bands, and they all end up sounding the same. I mean, they don't sound necessarily bad, but this is a rock band, and then you've got a orchestral thing, and then you get something else, and they all kind of seem to sound very similar. And it's nice when the guest engineer comes in with this band with a completely different style of music, and you go, the whole thing just comes to life. Wow, that's a whole different sort of spectrum that I'm listening to, and it can be really exciting when it really changes. And a really good engineer would kind of try to change what they do a little bit to accommodate the different styles. And as you said, Clive, some of these things are unlistenable.
Yeah.
To me, Chinese stuff is unlistenable. I can't listen to all that top end, but that's what they want.
Yeah, and it comes down to your musical education and training, because as an engineer, that's what you fall back on all the time. Oh, there's a cello. I know what a cello sounds like, right? Well,
yeah, not necessarily. You're bringing all of your preconceived notions, all of your biases. You're bringing into the equation. The first time I started mixing orchestral music, I strove to make it sound cool because sounding cool was what I knew how to do. And the orchestra director came over at some point and was like, what are you doing to the basses? And I was like, they sound awesome. Can't you hear? Like there's this unbelievable round low end. And she's like, yeah, but that's not what they sound like. And it was like, oh, okay. And I like backed way off on all of this, trying to make it sound cool. I probably mixed a half a dozen. This was the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. I probably mixed a half a dozen shows of theirs before I actually got a chance to listen to them in their concert hall. And then it was like, oh, that's what it's supposed to sound like. Yeah, it was, and then like from then on, like my approach was very different. But it was, again, I'm not a huge classical music fan. Two, I had rarely, if ever, actually heard a symphony in a symphony hall. I had heard recordings of symphonies, which were, of course, then colored by what they were played back on. So I was hearing a certain emphasis added to certain things that wasn't actually supposed to be there. And so that's just an audio bias, a really, really obvious one. But then,
I mixed an orchestra festival once. It was 5 days in the park in Vancouver. And one of the orchestras was a well-known small string orchestra from down east. And so I put a mix up, and the production manager and the general manager of the festival were beside me, and they're going, yeah, that's pretty acceptable. That's a good sound. And the director of the orchestra stopped conducting, told the first violinist just lead him through the charts, and came pounding out to the front of the house, popped his head up and said, oh, no, it sounds too much like a CD.
Yeah,
and what you have to do is you have to actually go and listen to an orchestra. If possible, go stand on stage and listen to an orchestra.
It's a very different things. I'm gonna only because I've been wanting to hear Erskine's take on this, and he did the finger of politeness. Pete.
I remember back years ago, bicentennial in New York City. Theater Technology did a lot of different events that day. One of them was a symphony orchestra in Lower Manhattan. We hired a musician who's not a mixer, but hired a musician to mix it. And he attended their rehearsals and had a full score with him and took notes. And we did not an incredible PA system, but it was like 8 to 12 double bass bins with horns, back in the bicentennial days. That's what we had. And we got an incredible review from the New York Times because they loved the way the mix sounded, because it was mixed by somebody who understood orchestral music. I don't do any mixing at all personally, unless you count the 75 microphones I just mixed this morning on all the intercom stations that were in this system. And I strive to keep them all the right level with my little DBX meter, so everybody sounds good. And
what sort of plugins are you using?
Well, in reality, there's a lot of DSP power in the Riedel system, and
so the smack compressor, that's the one.
Well, it all comes sort of defaulted to compress a lot, and I like to turn the compression off on the stage manager, because every time the stage manager stops talking, all of the PA is brought up to full volume, and you can understand what the stage manager is saying, because when she talks, it all goes away. You hear it all. But if I turn down the compressor to it's like 1 to 9, it defaults to, and I turn it down to 1 to 1, and all of a sudden the background noise goes away, and she can be heard much better. So I tend to do something like that. But as far as orchestral, as far as PA, I have absolutely no bias as far as what equipment to use, because I don't use it. But I do like a mix that is, 1, pleasant to hear, 2, not distorting my own ears. When I was on tour, I would wear in-ear monitors so I could listen to the mix on my in-ear monitors at a much lower level than live audio, and I much more enjoyed it that way. But rock and roll, I think I can't listen to it. It's just too loud. The whole point was run it to the loudest you can get your old PA system, and the audience loves it, but I don't. So.
Well, and yeah, Pete, I'll go straight to you. I was thinking, even Peter, comms guy, whatever, you guy, that, because I've had this experience of a certain amount of bias when you go back to the same hall that you were in before and it was a good show. There's this kind of thing, you walk in and are you like expected to sound good? It could be a completely different PA, completely different artist, completely different sound mixer, completely different thing, but you're already sort of like, you're kind of, conversely, you walk into a hall where the last show was, super loud rock show or something you didn't like or something that wasn't good, and you immediately, you can't help but associate, like as you walk into the room, you at a deep subconscious level associate a negative experience, and it absolutely colors what you hear.
There's a part of that, but I have also been on shows where a mixer I know comes in, and it's let's say a festival show, so lots of different mixers are mixing in one after the other, and he comes in and does his own little tuning with his own little bit of music, no special equipment, just his ear, and sounds so much better than whoever else had the system before, because it's their talent. They're talented, totally.
Absolutely. And so, there's none of this conversation is to imply in any way, shape, or form that, our internal biases color us from, if it's a scale from 1 to 100 of awful to great, that's literally like affecting 50% of the scale. It's probably affecting 5% of the scale, or 10, I don't know. That's part of what makes it interesting to me is what percentage that is. Wiejaczka, you had something to chime in with.
I got a list.
I bet you do.
But what comes to mind, Pete, is the perception of what something sounds like is off, like sometimes the marketing or sometimes the fit and finish. And one of those things is the original ClearCom GUI for Eclipse versus the one they came out with years and years and years later. And that same exact median frame had a different sound to it and a different finish because of the GUI change.
When ClearCom first made, I hope you can hear me because they're making loud sound out there. But when ClearCom first made their bell pack, their 2-wire bell pack system, they ultimately decided to put a particular curve into it so they could hear better with a big 4K boost, and it became the ClearCom sound, which other systems like RTS didn't have in it. And some people like that. They like ClearCom better because it has that voice sound.
And I have the exact opposite bias because ClearCom's industrial design is so terrible.
Correct. But when they changed that GUI, all of a sudden Eclipse, I mean, it probably sounded the same, but it felt like a more quality product to use. Because
the panels, I can't even.
Didn't even matter. None of that matters.
It makes my skin crawl just to think about using those panels.
Okay. Next thing on my list. So back to fit and finish, PA systems or a console that has cheap faders or like a console that has faders that don't have drag in them versus a console that do. The console that has drag in it sounds better. Doesn't even matter anything else about it. Or speakers that have a cloth face, like a VDOSC, sounds better than a Vertec that has an open component. There's just none of the rest of the stuff we're talking about matters. It's like the marketing of the product does matter. Some products, they're starting to rubberize the metal, and to me, that it's like that product sounds better because of that. It doesn't even matter anything else about it. It could be the same anything, but and I think that's why Yamaha with the wood, armrest, same exact thing with that, or Digico with the rubber ends, everyone
that's how you know a PM10 is better than a PM7, because the 10 has the wooden armrest and the 7 has the plastic armrest.
Exactly.
I used to always think that the heaviness of a speaker, how much wood is in the speaker, is going to dictate the quality. And I thought, this wedge weighs a ton. It must be the best. And then I ran into an M4.
Yeah.
Oh, they don't have to actually be heavy to sound really good. What do you know?
Yeah, I mean, and it goes as much as the cable too. Like a nice quality cable, when you plug that cable in, that thing you just plugged in will sound better than if you use some cheap cable. And we all know that doesn't really affect anything. Sometimes it can because of various reasons, but
but not really. And I mean, your point is that's where it really gets to, when we so often when we start talking about, well, I like this mixing console, or I like this thing, or I like that thing, or whatever, it sounds better. And it's basically none of us have ever done, I'm exaggerating, but I'm probably pretty close, a true double blind examination of I mixed on this console and then I mixed on that console, both of which I was super familiar with and both of which I liked the same. And because we walk into that with, this is the console I like to mix on and it feels cool. Oh, and I'll also, tomorrow I'm doing the same act in the same room, but I'm on this other console and I'm not as comfy with it. And to me, that second show doesn't sound as good. Now, maybe to somebody else, it sounded better. I don't know, but it felt not as good. and that absolutely colors.
But if you're not as comfy on it, it could very well be the truth.
Right. Broughton, you get to jump in because you're the host.
I was just going to say, not double blind, but I've certainly been in a situation where I've been on tour with a particular mixing board and, dialed it in as best as I can with that particular console. And then the next run, change boards, just switching up to something else and gone, whoa, okay, this is actually a little better or worse, but generally it's a step up of some sort. And I go, okay, I can get more out of this particular mixer than I can out of the other one, even though I was super familiar with the other one. It wasn't a familiarity thing. There was a difference in tonality and maybe the effects engines and some of these sort of things that can be a lot better on certain mixers. So not double blind, but certainly legitimate in terms of doing the best you can with one product and then switching to another product and doing the best you can with that and finding that, oh, I can get a little bit better with that.
Yeah, you can't really double blind a venue, can you?
No,
but back to that venue comment, like there is a venue in Chicago that sounds amazing every time I go there. And it is the venue. Like there is something about it that just, maybe it's the promoter and they like make the bands feel welcome, or I don't know, but like it's the same PA, same mixer, same venue.
So few and far between, I find.
Yeah.
So many venues in the US sound absolutely horrible.
Yeah, this one's great, but and then the other venue comment
that's your Canadian bias. Sorry, Pete, I had to
In
jump
North
in.
America.
That's your Canadian bias. Okay, go ahead.
I'm getting the Canadian here with venues. So like we've all been in arenas with steel roofs and glass, or wooden arenas. Like there's one in Chicago, there's a couple in Toronto. And those wooden arenas do sound better. There is physics involved, but there's also a mental thing of like when you first walk in and you see all that wood, there's like and that mental thing may be educated information from, your knowledge as an acoustician, but there's something there, and same thing with an arena with ice. When you walk in and the homosotes on that will sound a certain way. Some of that's science, and I think some of that's emotion,
It'll sound cold.
Clive.
I think that venues actually contribute to the sound of the show much more sometimes than we give them credit for. And I think the biggest struggle every day for most engineers with some experience is dealing with the venue du jour.
Parallel walls and reverberant
absolutely.
surfaces. Yeah, very difficult.
I'd like to share a picture of a new venue here in Las Vegas, which is just in the middle of construction. It is. Do you see that venue?
Yep.
It's right behind the venue where I'm in. It's totally spherical. The entire building is going to be covered with LEDs and all LEDs inside. But it's a round building with a curved ceiling, and I can't imagine what's going to happen here.
And they want to do major events in there, and I can't believe it's not going to be horrendous.
Well, you never know. Who knows? Maybe they have Chris Jaffe designing the acoustics. Who knows?
And they're building more of them. This is just the one in Vegas. I think there's going to be one in maybe in London.
I think they're promoted by the LED companies, but that's all. What it's all about.
Yeah, it's Madison Square Garden and somebody else.
Is it called the Knob?
Yeah. I don't know.
It's like a big knob.
I think it might be just
Called
called
the
the
guy
Sphere.
who designed it.
The suck knob.
I think the Sphere is it.
Yeah, I think it's the Sphere. It's the MSG Sphere.
Fear the sphere. I can't say that 3 times twice. Fear the sphere. Ed Whillock has not had a chance to chime in, and I saw him go 3 times. So, Ed.
Well, so great point so far. To the venue aspects, so there's a local venue here. It's a big old church that is now a community center, and they do a lot of events in there. And I was the in-house guy for a long time. And there's people who performed there many years ago and said, "Oh man, I remember this place sounds terrible." And they had done some acoustic treatment to the ceiling. and a couple things, and people come back and they have that like that bias of the venue. They're expecting it to be sound terrible, and they do their show and they're like, oh, that was not nearly as bad as I thought it was. Like, what happened? And I'll say, oh yeah, look, they put some panels on the ceiling. They did a couple of things. Now it still doesn't sound great, but it sounds, if you have that old reference of what it used to be, it's like a night and day difference. So so there's absolutely that venue aspect. Something that somebody else had touched on, I don't remember who brought it up, but like being surprised by hearing something like where you expect it's not going to be a good to being a good. I had a student who brought a recording in that they did at home, and the kid, he was a drummer, and he told me, he's like, oh yeah, I like using a 421 for my kick drum mic. And I was like, okay, I don't have great expectations for how this is going to sound, but let's hear it. And we had just put in our Augsburger. It's actually in that studio that's in my background. And he wanted to hear it for a reference and get my opinion on it, on his mix. And I was like really not thinking I was going to hear anything great from the kick drum. And I was pleasantly surprised. I was like, oh wow, this is like a very usable thing. And he had used some plugins, and he was like, yeah, and I boosted a bunch of low end, and it turned out like he was putting a shelf on it, and I was like, hey, just do a bell at 63, and I think that you got it, and it like made it an extremely usable kick drum. And I was like, wow, okay, I'm pleasantly surprised by this. I more so notice with my bias, when I walk into somewhere and I hear something, I'll be like, that sounds like they're using like kick drums, like talking about kick drums. If I hear on a live show like a super attacky kick drum kind of sounds triggery, I'm like, it's got to be a D6 on that thing. And then I'll look, and if I'm right, I'm like, yeah, well, I knew it because I heard this thing. And my bias is like, if I hear that tinny clicky kind of thing that I don't particularly like, I don't really like the sound of a D6. I know if I hear it really boxy, I'm like, oh, that's got to be a D112. And so I have these biases where like when I hear it, I'm like, oh, that's got to be that thing I really don't like typically. And whether I'm right or wrong is a different story. But it's less more of what if I see something and think it's going to sound terrible or not. It's more usually when I hear something terrible, I'm like, yeah, that's got to be the thing I really don't like. And I'm usually really bummed if it's the thing I really do like.
I think it's also much easier to identify things you don't like.
Of course, yeah.
Than things you do like.
That's true. That's very true.
In life.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully you like less things than you hopefully you unlike less things than you like.
There never used to be a dislike button on the Facebook. I still don't think there is there?
Nope.
Just an angry one.
Everybody would be smashing those. We wouldn't be, we wouldn't be counting likes. We'd be going for the dislike, I think.
Yeah.
At that point,
it's much funnier, I think.
Oh yeah, for sure.
YouTube has a down thumbs.
They do.
It does. They do, and everyone right now is probably pressing it just for fun because we're talking about
it. Hey.
I'm not encouraging them. I'm just saying now that we brought it up.
They're affecting the algorithm. Stop it.
They call that like recreational negativity is what they call it.
Yeah. But yeah, I try to be pretty self-aware of, I try to go into situations too. Like as somebody, I think somebody said that, or maybe Andrew was talking about like, oh, US venues sound terrible. And I kind of avoid going to big concerts a lot because I do think that they're just pushing SPL for the sake of SPL sometimes. And things are just, and then as Pete said, he doesn't like the loud rock concerts, So sometimes I have that bias walking into an arena show, and I'm like, I know it's going to be loud. I'm glad I have my earplugs kind of thing. But I try not to. I try to be like, okay, let's see what the environment is. I won't wear my earplugs for like the first couple songs so I can actually hear what it's like. And then I'll do that sound guy thing where, you walk over by the mix position, and you're like, oh yeah, I could do that better. And then I put my earplugs in and try to not let my biases ruin the rest of the show. But
the venue has such a integral, a big part of the sound. I've given up on so many venues. I just go, I'll go, if I can see that group outdoors, great. I'm going to go see them outdoors. Because every time I go to a venue and listen to it, this reverberation and everything, it just sucks.
Ed, if you want some rock music that's not too loud, they're loading in now. It's going to open in this month or maybe next month. Reopen American Utopia at the St. James.
Cool.
All right.
Best live show I've ever seen, I think.
Wow.
And if I don't start to see some sponsorship money from them immediately, I'm going to be a little perturbed. But it is interesting. The two things that I think happen with bias when with our preconceived notions as we walk in, 3, 5, 7, 12 different things. But one of them is when we acknowledge it and then we try to adjust for it. Because all we're really doing then is we're just then adding an anti-bias to our other, you know what I mean? It's like we're still trying to engineer our way around our preconceived notions. And then sometimes it's, so I'll give you an example from a million years ago. I was working at a university and I walked into a dance that was being done because we were doing some other thing in the same room. And one of the local tiny sound company guys had his PA in. And this was, I don't know, like 1992 or 93. We were definitely past the whole component PA stack, pyramid of death thing. Like that was not a thing that people did anymore. And that's what he had. He had like, the PV bass bin and a like EV mid and like weird like EV horns that didn't match. And like the
band thought it looked really cool.
Yeah, exactly. And it was definitely just a junkyard pile. It's exactly what it was. And, with an ancient old, I don't know, Tapco mixer or something. And I was just like, of course, immediately my bias kicks in of, man, one, this poor guy, because he clearly, is stuck in the 70s. And anyway, long story short, band kicks in. My memory tells me it sounded amazing. Now, the reality is it probably didn't sound amazing. It probably sounded pretty good. But I was so surprised that it wasn't awful that my memory remembers it as sounding amazing. Like my preconceived bias made me shift to the other direction, if that makes any sense. It's like, and I remember it as
lowered.
Yeah. And I just, I was like, and again, kudos to the guy who had the junk pile. He knew how to make it sound good. Like it sounded good. But, it's like you said, Ed, when you walk in and you see that they've, like, if I walk in and I see a drum kit with a sub kick in front of it, I'm immediately like, I'm not gonna like this. This is a thing I'm not gonna like. It's just we all have our things. Like we all have our little triggers that
Questlove used one for years.
Well, and
I
that's
don't think
they're
not inherently a bad thing. It's just,
of course not. It's one of those like not to pick on sub kicks or whatever. It's like, it was a thing that everybody jumped on for a while to solve all their problems, and it just whatever. And 99% of the time, it didn't sound better to me. So now I'm biased against it, and I just immediately judge anybody who's using it as, well, this isn't going to be a good night, And it's just I have a preconceived bias against any console that says Soundcraft on it. Sorry, Soundcraft, but I got burned on a couple of shows 437 years ago, and it's seared into my memory. That awful experience. I looked up and said Soundcraft right in front of me, and now I can't make it go away. I can't.
For me, it was DDA.
Yeah,
I
like
the DDA.
Oh no!
really
Not when
like
the power
those.
supply gets hot. You don't.
Well, for anyone that doesn't know, DDAs are Soundcrafts, basically.
They look the same, yeah. So they probably are.
I don't think they were back then.
Two designers from Soundcraft left and made DDA.
That's why they look so much the same.
And that's why they went through power supplies. Like they're okay. Now we've completely derailed.
I think Nathan. I don't think I've heard from Nathan what his bias might be.
For me,
Mhm.
Yeah, I really don't have biases. I just listen to no, seriously.
There's your bias right there.
Well, I come from a different perspective. I don't usually think about the gear as much as you guys do. So I'll walk in a room, and if it sounds good, it sounds good. If it sounds bad, is it the engineer, is it the gear, or what? But I'm more about the overall presentation. So if you walk into a room and everything's kicking and it's right on the money, what does it matter what's in there? I mean, it sounds weird, but in Brian's case with the guy with the junkyard, your preconceived notion is it's going to sound like crap. On the other hand, I don't look at that so much as I listen to what he's going to produce. So I don't know. I was interested in Pete's thing of cloth versus metal on a speaker, because now that is a bias I do have. When something's metal, I just naturally think it's going to be brighter and spitty and make a lot of noise. And it doesn't matter if the cloth one is doing the same thing. I kind of roll with that, but I can't think of too many other ones.
But that being said, I mean, you hit on something which is very interesting, which is in some ways, people who aren't, all they do is audio, walk in with a completely different set of biases. It's like you walk in and you're looking at maybe more of the bigger picture, and then already kind of forming sort of a, which is, but it's funny you said the thing about speaker grills, because speaker grills that are metal that have little holes in them, my brain tells me that that can't be good. It's stupid, like it's dumb. Like I intellectually know that that's not. But if I see like soft foam in my brain, I just for some reason think, oh, that's going to be more transparent.
Even though there's metal behind the soft foam,
which I know exactly. Like it's just
there's
dumb.
something about it.
It has bigger holes, the metal behind the foam.
Sometimes, but not always.
And honestly, like I absolutely admit that speaker arrays that look ugly to me are already behind the curve, like no pun intended line arrays. But it's like, if it just looks wrong, it just, the butterfly rig always looked so weird to me. And, and the thing is, I mixed on one and it was fine. Like it sounded fine, but it had to convince me that it wasn't going to suck because it just looked weird. And that's completely a bias. Like, it's just, I don't know anything about speaker engineering, nothing. So me judging what it looks like is stupid. Like, I don't know anything about that.
I wonder how Van
stuff.
Halen sounded with the white speaker cones that couple of seasons that they
amazing.
If Jim was mixing, I'm sure it would have been awesome. But
Ed, you mentioned walking in to see a band play and then you see something that you're like instantly judging. Years ago, during Detroit auto shows, like the producer's friend or something was a background singer in the Bob Seger band. So we all went out and saw Bob Seger play the Palace Arena in Detroit, north of Detroit. And this is an arena like I grew up doing arena PAs in EAW 850s. Like, so I know what that place sounds like. And we walk in and there's these massive Showco Prism arrays. And I had never heard one, but I've always heard all the horror stories on how bad they had sounded, right? And this is like early 2000s. So I'm like, oh, this is going to be terrible. Good thing I have my earplugs. And we're sitting like right at the arena, like 45 off the edge of the stage, where it like usually doesn't sound very good because there's like side fills, and like we're up we're like maybe in the front of the 200 level or like the top of the 100 level, like that kind of, 1/3 up. I got to tell you, it was one of the best shows I've ever heard in my life ever. Like, it sounded amazing. And
but you think that's Bob Seger or the PA?
I think it was everything, because you know, if Bob Seger's good, the engineer has to be as good as the band. And then if the engineer's good, he probably has a longtime PA tech he works with that probably is a show co-staff person. And the way that they used to work is each tech had their own set of gear. So he probably cared for that PA differently than other, you know, who know, like the, you know, it stems from the top usually, I find, you know, I mean,
The only time I was ever in that arena, it was with a 850 rig for Inigo Montoya.
oh, it's probably the one I used to do.
Go ahead, Alex.
It was it might, yeah, it was local, I think. The
Have been us.
I think
Alex,
maybe I'm wrong, but I think we should point out that the point of all of these things, all of our biases, are a result of a lot of things culminating to a perfect mix, a perfect sauce, right? You know, I share, you know, Nathan and Pete and Ed, your experiences. I've walked into really old venues. The best sounding show I've ever heard was Filter on a set of ground stacked, I think it was KF850s. Are those the trap boxes, the old ones? And the PA was 15 years old or something when I saw the band, but it was the best sounding show I've ever heard. I've also heard, you know, and he was mixing on a 4K, and I've also heard things on Vertec line arrays. Two bands on the same PA. It was a festival, a national act opening for another national act. The first national act sounded terrible. It was way too compressed. Everything was compressed. I think that was the engineer's fault on that one, because after that, the next band sounded completely different. It was a night and day difference. And I think that's just a testament to good musicians, good engineer. It can change the way a PA sounds. You know, I think the PA is the
finish goes not just with the products, but the engineer.
Right. I think the PA actually in all of this sauce is a valuable and important part of this mixture, but we've all mixed in places where the PA wasn't ideal and had great sounding shows, and had bands play that was a great band and had great sounding shows because it was a great band and you didn't have to do too much to the band itself, you know, to make things sound good.
There was a time when the headliner would compress or turn down or do something to the opener so they wouldn't sound as good. I would hope that by the time you saw your show, that wasn't the policy anymore. But there was certainly a long time where they would go, I don't like this band. We're just going to crank them down a bit there, and okay, you sound terrible, so we can potentially sound better.
Right.
You had something to say, Clive? I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, a couple of things. To your comment, I've actually been a house engineer on festivals where I've had opening acts go, can you kind of make sure that they're not as loud as us and, you know, fix it up so we sound good? Actually have people say that to me, which is amazing, you know.
Do people do
and
that?
The other thing, sorry, that I was going to finish on is that, you know, a good sounding show is always going to be the same chain of things. It's going to be usually great players, really good source pickup. That's really, really important. And the bigger the venue and the uglier the venue, the more important that is. A great performance, and then a really good engineer who knows his band and who knows to get the best out of what he's working with, you know. All those things have got to be perfectly right to get a good show.
Mm-hmm. And the system engineer, whoever's putting that PA together and aligning it, to me, that's the most important of all those things. The other parts could be a little weaker, but if that thing is done perfectly, then that makes everyone else's job so much easier.
Well, I agree that having, you know, a good system that's well put together and tuned is important, but you can have that and have a total crap show come out of it. Whereas the other things really do contribute to a better sounding show, regardless, even if you've got a little itty bitty PA that's not enough for the venue. You know,
I think we're getting close to the end there, Brian. But Ed, you have a comment?
Yeah, so I'll actually talk about again this studio that's in my background. One of the things when I was choosing what gear to put in there, you know, there was a little bit of a committee. I kind of had the final say, but there was a talk of, oh, let's just do in the box and let's just get like Focusrite interfaces and use Dante and all this stuff. And I really pushed hard for the console, one for like the teaching aspect, because that's what this studio was actually built for, to be a teaching facility. But they did want to be able to get revenue from it. And I said, when you've got a giant console in a studio, you're in a studio. That when that is the centerpiece of your room and you walk in, you can't miss this 8'2" wide analog desk. There's just something that says, oh, wow, this is serious. When you walk into a studio that's just in the box with, a rack of pre's, that might look impressive, but it's not this, sitting at a console and seeing that. At the same time, too, when I was building equipping this studio, it came into my possession a guitar that I bought from somebody that had pickups that had been previously owned by Peter Frampton. And I'm not a huge Frampton fan or anything, but one of the motivations for buying that guitar, and it was dirt cheap, so it wasn't like I spent a ton of money on it, but one of my motivations was to keep it as a studio piece. And when you've got that player who's having a hard time nailing something, be like, oh, why don't you try it on that guitar? That has Peter Frampton's old pickups in it. So these two things were to play on people's biases of, well, if you've got a giant console, it's got to be better. It's analog. Oh, it's got to be better. And then these pickups were played by someone famous that you've heard of, and whether you're a fan or not, that has some sort of magic to it. So I implicitly used, people's biases for those two choices because, as part, not the sole factor. The guitar was kind of the sole factor, but the console wasn't. But yeah, playing on people's biases to make them think things are bigger and grander and better than they are is something I think a lot of us have encountered or done or been on the other side of, or people have tried to impress us with this big shiny thing. And as we were talking about, I was thinking, yeah, I've definitely had that at least partially in mind with stuff in this studio. And same thing with those Augsburger monitors. It's like, who has Augsburger monitors in their house? We do. So come mix at our studio. It's all those sort of things to inflate what we had to offer. And we had a great sounding room, so we had a lot to offer already, but this just was the icing on the cake, and that's why I keep it as my background. It looks good.
Well, Mac was getting ready to jump in there, but I don't want to. He's now waving me off. He's like, Erskine, I saw the finger twice, so that usually means that you have a wise thing to help us wrap this up.
Big consoles are great, and certainly in a teaching situation, that's really impressive and is good for the students. On the other hand, one of the first concerts I ever really enjoyed, I was an A2 at the Rheingold Music Festival in the early 70s in Central Park, and the Beach Boys came in, and our PA was like 4 double bass bins and 2 3x6 sectoral horns with double 60-watt drivers. Nothing very impressive, but it did the job. And they brought in this little tiny console, this wide, to see the screen, and it met probably with 10 inputs, all Neve components, and it sounded exactly like the record, exactly, including all of the delays. And they had a tape delay. They did all the weird stuff. So it's not the size of your tool, it's the size of your engineer.
It's how you use it.
Well, and I don't even know how better to wrap it up than with a good old size of your tool reference. So that's fantastic. I will say we just barely touched on this topic. So this one's going to go back in the hopper again, because I still think there's a lot to tease out about this. The how much the gear costs, how much you spent for the gear versus you didn't spend it, somebody else spent it, how much the person's getting paid who's mixing versus not, versus I could go on and on and on. And if we think that these things don't affect how we hear what we're hearing, we're fooling ourselves. Like that's what bias is. That's the whole point of it, is it colors what you hear. It colors the way that you hear it. And even when you know it exists, it still changes your perception of reality in a way that's almost impossible to avoid. And then there's the whole, conversation then as audio professionals, what do we do with that information so that we can still deliver, the highest quality product. Anyway, I want to thank everybody that joined us. Great panel, great discussion, great topic. And if you are interested in ever joining us, you'll notice if you're watching this YouTube video later that there is in the description a little email. You can send me a note and I'll be happy to add you to the list of folks that join this. The only qualifications are that you're interested in audio and you have an opinion. And that's it, because that's pretty much all the rest of us are. So with that, I want to thank everybody. We're going to give the big wave and ask for Andy to roll that fabulous bean footage.
Yeah, well, that's like just your opinion, man.
And we're still